in our series of messages here on Hebrews chapter 11. And this is the chapter where it talks about all kinds of characters, all those different people that are represented in these costumes here, who by faith were able to do all kinds of things. And we have all these different artifacts that are here that symbolize different activities that these people, these heroes of faith, did in ancient times. Now, this letter in the New Testament is called the letter to the Hebrews. And so that means this letter was written to Jewish Christians. And Jewish people know their Bible really well. The Orthodox or the practicing Jewish people really know their Bibles. And so in this chapter, when the writer just has to mention the name of somebody, all these stories come popping up in their mind. And he's giving a litany of all these people, all these stories that are all people who lived by faith. And so the writer of the scriptures there says, what more can I say? I don't have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. Now, kids, we had some sermons on this. What do you remember about Barak? Or Barak, some people would say. What's Barak? He was a general that took the army with the lady. You know what? That's not as well known as Gideon. What about Samson? You remember Samson? What do you know about him? Strong guy. Jephthah. He was a fighter who helped Israel get rid of a big enemy. But you know what's interesting? We don't quite know our stories like the people in the Old Testament. The Jewish people know them. But we do have the same scriptures. And it's good for us to read these and to be reminded of them. Because there's more yet. These different people who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions. If you're talking to Jewish people, every one of those brings up stories. Boom, boom, boom. You can hear them all. Quenched the fury of flames, escaped the edge of the sword, weakness turned to strength, became powerful in battle, routed foreign armies. All these are like flashes of memories that are just going off in people's minds. And the one we're going to look at today is this one, that women receive back their dead, raised to life again. Well, the woman we're talking about here that this would have just brought up in their mind is this woman that we just heard about. Pastor Rob talked about this lady here in the Bible that had this amazing experience with the prophet. Now, kids, you've got your sermon notes out there. I see they're open up there. I'm going to help you so you know how to fill it out so you can get your chocolate bar today. Here we go. Here's the topic. It's the heroes of faith. It's the Old Testament. And there's two scriptures, Hebrews 11:35 and the story out of 1 Kings 17. So you can write that down, capture those things. And we also are talking about the widow. We don't even know her name. She is just this girl, this lady that lived there, not famous, not rich. But her and Elijah are the people that are in this story, the widow and Elijah, and it happened during the period of the kings. So as we're going through the story, kids, you can be writing down key points that come to your mind. Now, whenever you read a Bible story, it's important that you read what came before the story and then what came after the story. So we heard a story today from 1 Kings 17. But the question you need to ask yourself is, what happened in 1 Kings 1 to 16? So if you have your Bibles open, turn to them to the book of 1 Kings. Because what happens in 1 Kings 1 through 16 sets the place and the context for the story in 1 Kings 17. So the book of Kings is literally the story of the kings of Israel. And it starts with David, famous king, and then his son Solomon. And under Solomon is when the temple was built, and all these amazing things were put together. And Israel reached its highest peak under Solomon, famous around the world of its day. In fact, the Queen of Sheba came to hear about this wonderful nation and the wisdom of this king. And she came to find out what was going on in Israel. So the story of Israel was that it was at a peak here. And then, when Solomon died, civil war erupted. Competing nations. Some of the tribes wanted to be in charge and others wanted to be in charge. And they ended up splitting the kingdom. And that's why in this picture, you have a crown here which represents the glory of Israel, and there is a tear through the whole thing. Because in the book of 1 Kings, it describes how the 10 northern tribes left, the 2 southern tribes were apart, and the kingdom was torn in two. And the book of 1 Kings begins to tell you story after story of one bad king after another. And the fortunes of Israel went down as the kings went down. And as the king went, so went the people. And then there came a really bad king, one of the worst in the Bible. His name was Ahab. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 16, he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. And one of the things he did was he married a really bad woman. Her name was Jezebel. She was a foreigner from up north of Israel. And she lived in the land where they didn't worship God. They worshiped Baal. Now, Baal was a very common god of its time and a very powerful god. Baal was the god of the rain, god of money, god of that kind of power. And that the kings of that day were people who had the responsibility to provide for their nation. But kings knew they couldn't make it rain. And so kings always prayed to some god that could provide the rain and make their nation prosperous. Ahab was praying to Baal, the popular god of the day, saying, you will bring prosperity. You bring the rain. You make us prosperous and rich and powerful. And that's the God that he had the people of Israel begin to worship. In fact, he even set up an image to Baal right there. And it was terrible. Now, we kind of look back at this old story and think, yeah, they worshiped gods back then. But you know what? We do have a parallel today. We have similar expectations of the political rulers of our day. When you think of it, we expect a good prime minister will make a good economy. And if they do well, we vote them in. If they don't provide a good economy, we vote them out. Because our political leaders are supposed to make it politically prosperous, make it economically prosperous. We have similar expectations, just not quite as blatant as Baal worship. But we have expectations about the political leaders of our day. But in 1 Kings chapter 16, they had come to this point where Israel was completely following Baal. And suddenly, in 1 Kings chapter 17, in steps a man named Elijah. He comes with no introduction in the Bible. He suddenly appears in chapter 17. He has no credentials. He has no political position or power anywhere. He just breaks in and declares a judgment against Ahab. Now, Ahab was the powerful guy. But just this man's name is the beginning of rebuke. His name in Hebrew is Eliah. The first half of this name, Eli means my God, And Yah is the short word for Yahweh. His name is, my God is Yahweh. And Elijah steps into the scene and he points at Ahab and he said, I'm going to prove to you that Baal is not the provider of all prosperity. I'm going to be declaring in the name of Yahweh that there will be no rain. And the drought hits. And the confrontation is on. There is a power confrontation between Baal, the systems of its day to provide, and Yahweh. Now, this is a direct confrontation to Ahab, and it's also a direct confrontation to his wife Jezebel, because she was the one that brought the whole Baal worship to Israel. And so here is the map of where these things are happening. Elijah was from a little place called Tishbe, and he had the confrontation in Samaria against Ahab, who was living right there with the queen. And he said, there's going to be no more rain. And God said, okay, now Elijah, I want you to leave and go live by the brook Kerith. And you are to leave the land of Israel. You're not going to benefit from anything from Ahab. You're not going to take any food from this land, because Ahab could say, see, I gave you food. You've got your food because I provided for you. You're just part of the system like everybody else. God said, no, you just go to this brook and I will feed you. And the ravens brought food to him. Who would have ever have thought that God would provide with ravens, with crows? That's not the way we would have thought how things should work. But God said, you just trust me. I will provide for what you need. Now, this is exactly the promise of Baal. Baal said, I will provide what you need. I am the God of prosperity. I'm the God of the rain. And any good that you have is because I give it to you. God says, we're going to challenge that head on. You leave that whole system, no benefit at all, and I will provide for you. And so there he was, sitting by the brook, obeying God. And then it got worse. The brook dried up because the drought was happening. And he had no water. We don't know what happened to the ravens, but God said, okay, now it's time for you to move. And I want you to move up north, way up here to Zarephath. And I've told a widow there that she's going to provide for you. Now, this is in Phoenicia. This is Jezebel's home country. He's walking right into the furnace of opposition. He's going to go right to the very land that has been promoting the Baal worship, and God was going to show that he will provide for him. And again, who would have thought that you would pick a widow who has no food to be the provider? This is not the normal conventional thinking of its day. But that's when the miracle happened. The story you heard Pastor Rob say, that they had all they needed. For as long as that drought was there, she had all the flour and all the oil she needed. She and her son and Elijah ate well. That when you read a story in the Bible, you need to read what happened before that story and what happens after the story. So what happened after this nice miracle of being fed food and water? It gets worse. Her son dies. And she is so angry about this. She storms into Elijah and said, because she had given him a room upstairs to stay in as her guest. And he said, why did you ever show up here and barge into my life and expose my sins and kill my son? And Elijah said, well, give me your son, because she was holding him in his arms. He died. So she gave the boy to him. He took the boy upstairs to his room and laid him out on the bed. And then Elijah prayed. And listen to what Elijah said. Oh God, my God, Eliah, why have you brought this terrible thing on this widow who opened her home to me? And why have you killed her son? He is just as angry as she is about this. Have you ever had that happen? You're trying to serve the Lord, you're doing everything you know that he says, and things don't go well. In fact, they get worse. And often we say, okay, God, here I am, trying to serve you, I'm trying to obey you, and then this happens. And we can get angry at God, just like the widow was angry, and just like Elijah. Now, Elijah took this angst of his, and he picked up the boy, put him on the bed, and stretched himself full length on top of the boy, praying with all his might, God, put the breath back in this boy. And he does it 3 times. It's like Elijah is insisting that God fix this. You know, when we go through hard times, it does strengthen your praying. You pray a little more desperately when things are desperate. And he had this desperate prayer before God and said, God, put the breath back in him. And it says in the scripture that God listened to Elijah and he put the breath back in the boy. And he picked up the boy and he carried him downstairs and he gave him to his mother and he said, here's your son. And he is alive. Wow. The widow said, now I know you really are a prophet. And she just declares her faith and her confidence in God in the midst of a place that does not worship Yahweh. She is declaring her belief and her faith in God's provision. Wow, what a story that is. But I want to point out to you that every single one of the heroes that are in our faith series here, Hebrews 11, every one of these heroes, all these stories from Hebrews chapter 11, every single one of them were in difficult circumstances, facing really big problems. And in the midst of their problems, they called out to God, and God showed up in ways you would never have imagined. Who would have thought that God would provide by crows? Who would have thought God would provide by a penniless widow? Who would have thought that in a battle, God would make it rain at exactly the right moment so that the chariots couldn't run? It's in the midst of our difficulties when we call out to God that we are most likely to see the evidence of his hand. And so, folks, this is my word to you. Whatever you're facing, whatever difficult circumstance or problem that is just weighing on you, this just might be the best opportunity for you to see God's hand. If, like the people in Hebrews 11, if you have faith in God. Now, what is faith? Sometimes we're a little bit unsure. What do we mean by faith? Here's a good working definition. If I say I have faith in Pastor Rob, it means I have interpersonal trust with him. So when we say we have faith with God, it means we have interpersonal trust. And you only need trust, you especially need trust when things are not evidently working out perfectly. When there's uncertainty. When life is not for sure. How is your interpersonal trust with God now? The stories in Hebrews 11 are example after example of people facing real problems and having trust in God anyway. And you know, we're invited to be people of faith. And I invite you to be encouraged with these stories of faith. Dramatic ones, often way more difficult than our problems. But if they can do it, we can do it. And we'll see God showing up in ways that maybe you hadn't imagined, in ways that you would not have anticipated, is when God really shows up and shines. So we live in expectancy that God will provide, that God will solve, that he'll make a way, that he's the faithful one. Like, hang in there, because in the midst of all of life's uncertainties, that is where faith actually is exercised. And so I'm going to invite you to whatever's on your mind, whatever you've been thinking about, whatever's a problem that you're facing, whatever difficulty that's pressing on you, or uncertainty, or fear, you bring that before God. And you pray that in his presence, that God will show up in your set of circumstances. As we come to the end of this service, here is a benediction. This same God who takes care of me will supply all your needs from his glorious riches, which have been given to us in Christ Jesus. That's a good word, because life is uncertain. There are no guarantees in life. And this walk by faith that we see in Hebrews 11 is no guarantee that life will be easy for anybody. But the guarantee is God will be there with you. And so, go with this confidence that he will provide all that you need according to his riches and glory. God bless.